From the general to the very specific, I want to take advantage of my position as being Schroders, the host here today, to just tell the Schroders story. Well, today Schroders is solely an asset manager. We've got around 4,600 employees, and I think it's around £450 billion of assets under management. But that's not how we started, and I nearly kind of titled this, Schroders. Investment management through accident or design. It was like life, really. It's been a mixture of the tides of history bringing us to this point, a mixture of chance, a mixture of design, and for narratively speaking, a very satisfying accident actually is on the route to our place here as solely asset managers. Well, we didn't begin anywhere near this. We began in Hamburg in the 18th century when a young man, Christian Matthias Schroder, opened a firm of merchants in 1767. He had been destined for the priesthood, but went to visit his brother in Bremen and thought the port life looked much more interesting than the clerical life, and became an apprentice to a merchant and set up his own firm of merchants. And he was trading across the Baltic and right across the Atlantic to the Americas. And this was the ship, the Francisca, that plied the Brazilian route. And I would really not fancy crossing the South Atlantic on a ship that size, but this was a regular journey for the Schroders. The tides of history had obviously affected Schroder's business. He felt the push of Napoleon's wars in Europe and the pull of London as a commercial centre, and sent two of his sons, teenagers, to London in 1800 and 1802. They arrived to carry on their father's business in the commodity trade, benefiting from the Royal Navy's protection of ships coming from bringing sugar from the West Indies into London, but quickly found themselves being in the centre of London's international commercial and financial world, being called upon by other German merchants to provide financial services, I suppose we would say, particularly commercial credit, and very quickly built up a business accepting business, providing commercial credit, and that was very successful. So by the mid-19th century, the business model had expanded to include bond issuing. The first bond was issued in 1853 to finance a railway in Cuba from plantation to port, sugar being a commodity that the Schroders knew very well. And this is one of the bonds issued in 1870 to finance the first railway in Japan. This is the railway from Tokyo to Yokohama. So Schroders issued this bond in 1870. Japan wanted to, obviously the Meiji Empire, wanted to modernise, and found other houses in London were a little cautious, Japan never having entered the capital markets before. But Schroders, very proud of this, saw the opportunities and the potential of Japan and issued the bond, and very successful that was. So by 1914, Schroders by capital was the second largest of the merchant banks in the city of London. Asset management at that stage was really limited to managing the partners' own wealth and that of friends and family. And being a prominent Anglo-German family, they did find themselves as neighbours of another prominent Anglo-German family, which is the British royal family. After John Henry Schroder had issued a bond to the Confederate side in the American Civil War, made a lot of money on that, and bought his first country house, quite a modest country house, but by chance, it was in Surrey, by chance the neighbours were Queen Victoria, just across the park, Windsor Great Park. And John Henry Schroder became good friends with two of Queen Victoria's daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Helena. Helena married Christian of Schleswig-Holstein. And John Henry Schroder was knighted by Queen Victoria for services to the royal household. He managed Helena and Beatrice's accounts and investments. And such as the Anglo-German nature of the Schroder family at the time, that John Henry Schroder had inherited a Prussian baronetcy. Then he got the baronetcy from Queen Victoria and got special dispensation from Queen Victoria to use both titles. So he was rather unusually known as Baron Sir John Henry Schroder. But the Anglo-German ties were really quite important in Schroder's history going forward. It caused them quite a few problems, as you might expect, during the First World War. But after the First World War, Schroders then went into their first investment product, an investment trust launched in 1924, the Continental and Industrial Trust. And the whole premise of this investment trust was to bring together the capital that Schroders knew about in Britain and in America, where they'd opened a bank in 1923, and the clients and the potential, the industrial potential that they knew about in Germany. When Germany at that time, obviously it was very difficult, if not impossible, to raise capital in Germany. So Schroders launched this trust, and its every investment for the first 2 years was actually in German industrial concern. And this is a photograph of a wheel and axle assembly shop in Dortmund in 1925. You can just see the kind of power of German heavy industry there. And it's a feature of Schroders and other investment management activities in merchant bank houses during certainly the first half of the 20th century. It's a very close relationship between the investment management side of what the firm was doing and the issuing and corporate finance side of what the firm was doing, because this company, this wheel, excuse my German, Deutsche Luxemburgische Bürgerwerks und Hüter AG, they were actually corporate clients of Schroders as well. So the balance sheet, their investment trust, was holding shares of a firm that they were advising as a corporate client. I have to say that by 1927, fortunately, the Conti, as it was known, had diversified and was now investing also in American and Latin American and other European securities as well. I mentioned accidents in Schroders' path to becoming investment managers, asset managers. Very actually, an actual aeroplane accident in July 1928. Very mysterious, caused a lot of interest in the newspapers. Captain Alfred Löwenstein, a Belgian financier of rather colourful, flamboyant nature. He was trying to corner the market in artificial silk. He had a lot of investments in electric generation, in tramways and railways and so forth, which he put into holding companies. He was flying across the English Channel in July 1928 and disappeared. His body was found a couple of weeks later, washed up, near the French coast. And so there's an illustration from a newspaper showing the way the doors opened in the lavatory compartment of his private plane. So had he accidentally, instead of going back into the cabin, opened the door and fallen out into the English Channel. There's some doubt about this because you can see here the slipstream from the engine would have made it very, very difficult to open the door. Caused a lot of speculation. I don't think it's ever been satisfactorily resolved. But one of the main beneficiaries, well, apart from Löwenstein's wife and son, one of the main beneficiaries was actually Schroders. And in a rather sensational book in the 1980s, a journalist investigating this speculated for a moment, well, Schroders benefited so much from this because they took over the management of Löwenstein's holding companies for Löwenstein's wife and son for about 20 years. They'd benefited from it so much. Was it possible that they were involved in some kind of dark events across the English Channel? Fortunately, that wasn't pursued by this journalist. But suffice to say, it was a very big part of Schroders' business in the 1930s and contributed perhaps around a fifth of the firm's profit in that decade. So that's the kind of satisfying accident in our path to asset management. Rather more conventionally, after the Second World War, we started involving ourselves in pension fund management. The first fund we took on was in 1947 for a British brewery company who wanted to diversify their pension fund, which wasn't too difficult because it consisted at that point only of British consuls and shares in the brewery itself. At this point I need to mention something else that happened to Schroders in the post-war period. They had a lot of money tied up in the standstill, in the German standstill, came in 1931. Those funds came back in 1954. Schroders started to look around. They had to expand. At the same time, a very similar firm called Helbert Wag was looking to reap the rewards of success, perhaps. Helbert Wag was a similar size merchant bank in Britain with a very large client base, industrial clients. And they'd been also taking on pension funds since 1946, very successfully, having a new mandate every month during the 1950s. Because of the tax regime at the time, the partners couldn't take any benefit from a dividend. And they'd also developed such a huge base of talent in their second rank of managers that succession planning was actually going to be very difficult for Helbert Wag. But merging with Schroders would give all this talented generation of Helbert Wag managers a chance to develop their careers and stay together. So the two firms merged in 1960 and developed a very large corporate client base. This is a brochure from 1965, a nice kind of 1960s white heat of technology design. But in this whole brochure, investment management only merits 3 lines, and very much seen as an additional service that's provided to corporate finance clients. And often pension funds were taken on and managed by J. Henry Schroder Wag, as it was then known. The pension funds would be taken on at very low or even no fees at all as part of a favour to the corporate finance clients. And again, there's that symbiosis between the corporate finance side of the business and the investment management side. So Helbert Wag, for example, in the 1950s, when they were issuing for a corporate finance client, it was understood that their investment clients would take at least a quarter of those issues, and that would cut down on some of the fees and commission that you'd otherwise encounter. So it seemed like a kind of a good deal for everybody. In 1967, shortly after this brochure was printed, Schroders launched their first unit trust, and quickly afterwards another unit trust, appealing to the middling rich, which is a very kind of British expression. But this is another very successful development for Schroders. I find it quite difficult to illustrate corporate investment management. But this is an advertisement from one of our Australian branches in 1982. I'm just thinking of the winds of history that we've all been buffeted by and can't be avoided in our business. And this was the time also to note that Schroders were internationalising. It's always been an internationally focused firm, but in the post-war period, in the 60s, from the 60s onwards, it started opening offices around the world. This in Australia, and you can see it's still thinking of itself as a merchant bank, even though by this stage our investment management activities are increasing quite significantly, and the rise of kind of institutional investment from this time onwards, and a real decrease in those investment trusts, which were being picked off now for the kind of good quality shares that they were holding. And just a quick note on how the actual practice of fund management has developed. This is one of the lovely things we found. We're clearing out some of our records in storage, and found somebody had left behind their desk diaries. And this is one of the fund managers actually working in the kind of Japanese fund management, Asian fund management. So this is day-to-day activities, noting down the prices. And computerization reached Schroders at the late 60s to carry out things like portfolio valuations. But the actual working portfolio record was double spread of A4 with the buys written in blue down the left-hand side of the page and the sales written in red on the right-hand side of the page. And it was only into the mid-1990s that personal computers became universal here. Before that, the ratio of staff to computers was about 1 to 10. Obviously, now today, so obviously IT is obviously a hugely crucial part of any operations here, and our Chief Executive Officer likes to refer to this actually as a data processing industry that we're now in. Just finally moving on to a little bit of strategy. In 2000, very bold, very brave decision was made by our then CEO, Wyn Bischoff, and our Chief Executive, Govie Mallinckrodt, and Bruno Schroder, that it was now no longer really possible for Schroders to compete as an investment bank with the giants of Wall Street, and sold the investment bank to Citigroup in 2000, at which point Schroders then became solely in asset management. And someone's asked me, why didn't we sell everything at that point? Why not? Lots of people do that. And so I'm going to refer to a rather old slide. Why didn't we sell off everything? Well, I think one of the very important reasons why we didn't sell off everything is the Schroder family. We're about 47% owned still by Schroder family or family trusts, and the family is actually really quite attached to the firm. We've got 3 generations here. On the right, it's Baron Bruno Schroder. I was talking about our Anglo-German connections. He was born in Germany, as a German citizen, until the 7th of August 1914, when, as a kind of emergency, he was naturalised as a British citizen, but retained those those Anglo-German ties. His surviving son, Helmut, on the left, kept the firm going right through the Second World War, when we did very, very little business. In fact, our most profitable business was leasing 2 trawlers, fishing trawlers in the Irish Sea. But he felt the need to keep the firm going when, again, would have been the easier decision would have been to stop. And Helmut's son, Bruno Schroder, who is head of the family today, sitting there in his shorts, he, I think, probably felt that on his watch he didn't want the firm to lose its independence or disappear, and supported the decision to retain the asset management side of the firm. I'll just finish very briefly with a timeline which only goes up to 2017. Obviously, many things have happened. Just to say that I'm sure we're developing not in an accidental way anymore, but in a thoroughly strategic way, entering into partnerships and developing new businesses, including the purchase in 2013 of Casino's wealth management